Smokey Yunick wasn't just a mechanic, he was a mastermind who lived in the gray areas of NASCAR's rulebook. Some called him a cheater, others a genius. But the 13 tricks he pulled off, NASCAR never forgot, or forgave. In 1967, Smokey Yunick rolled out what looked like a bone-stock Chevy Chevelle. To the naked eye, it was showroom perfect, exactly what NASCAR demanded. But Smokey didn't play by appearances. He had quietly shrunk the car. Using subtle craftsmanship, he scaled down the body panels by fractions of an inch, lowered the roofline ever so slightly, adjusted the windshield angle, and narrowed the stance. None of these tweaks were obvious on their own, but together they transformed the Chevelle into a sleeker, faster, more aerodynamic machine. Inspectors used tape measures, yardsticks, and gut instinct to check cars back then. Smokey knew their limits. He engineered the Chevelle so that every measurement just barely fell within what NASCAR considered legal. To the officials, it passed. To rival teams, it looked suspicious. And on the track, it was untouchable. Drivers swore the car cut through the air differently, gliding on the straights with a speed no stock car should have had. When word spread about what Smokey had pulled off, NASCAR panicked. They banned the Chevelle almost immediately and rewrote body measurement rules to be more precise. But the damage was done. The myth of Smokey's Outlaw Chevelle was born. Fans hailed it as the smartest cheat in NASCAR history. Officials called it a disgrace. But even they had to admit one thing. Smokey Yunick had just built what many still call the most illegal car the sport had ever seen. When NASCAR capped gas tanks at 22 gallons, most teams accepted the limit. Smokey Yunick didn't. Instead of enlarging the tank, he turned the fuel line into a hidden reserve. By stretching it to more than 11 feet long and making it wide enough to hold almost 5 extra gallons, Smokey created a second gas tank disguised as plumbing. It was so simple, so devious, and so effective that officials didn't even notice at first. On race day, this trick gave Smokey's cars a massive advantage. While competitors dove into the pits for fuel, his car kept circling, lap after lap, gaining precious time. Inspectors eventually discovered the scheme and were furious. They tore out the gas tank, thinking they'd finally exposed Smokey's biggest cheat. But the genius of the trick wasn't just in the extra miles, it was in the loophole itself. Nowhere in the NASCAR rulebook did it say how long or how wide a fuel line could be. Smokey had followed the letter of the law, even if he'd obliterated its spirit. This single innovation forced NASCAR to rewrite its rules on fuel systems, and it cemented Smokey's reputation as the man who could outthink an entire sport. The showdown that followed Smokey's fuel line scandal became NASCAR legend. Inspectors, convinced they had finally cornered him, yanked the gas tank out of his Chevelle and set it aside as evidence. Without the tank, they figured the car couldn't run. Case closed. But Smokey had one last card to play. He slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and fired up the engine. To the shock of everyone watching, the Chevelle roared to life. Smokey dropped it into gear and drove the car away, without a gas tank installed. The car had enough fuel stored in that 11-foot line to keep running, making the inspectors look foolish. Smokey even rubbed salt in the wound. According to lore, he leaned out the window and quipped, "Better put that tank back. There's still 9 gallons in the line." Whether he really said it or not, the story spread like wildfire. Smokey had humiliated the officials, showing the world that NASCAR's rulebook was no match for his creativity. On paper, every NASCAR frame in the 1960s was supposed to be symmetrical. In reality, Smokey Yunick realized symmetry was overrated, especially on oval tracks, where cars spent almost every second turning left. So he designed what became known as the offset chassis. By subtly shifting the frame to one side, Smokey redistributed the car's weight, pressing the tires harder into the track on left turns. The effect was dramatic. More grip, more stability, and faster cornering. To the casual observer, the car looked normal. To Smokey's drivers, it handled like magic. Rivals cried foul, but NASCAR couldn't point to a rule that explicitly banned it. Once again, Smokey was living in the gray zone. Eventually, officials rewrote the chassis regulations to close the loophole. But not before Smokey's crooked cars gained a reputation for sticking to the track in ways that others simply couldn't. It was yet another example of his genius. Smokey didn't just build fast cars, he built smarter ones. And every time NASCAR thought they had him, he found another blind spot in the rulebook. Roll cages were designed for one purpose: driver safety. But in Smokey Yunick's hands, they became something far more cunning. Smokey figured out that if he used slightly oversized tubing, he could turn parts of the roll cage into hidden fuel storage. On the outside, it looked like standard safety equipment. Inside, it carried precious gallons of fuel that no inspector could see. This trick gave his cars extra range and less time in the pits, which in racing terms often meant the difference between victory and defeat. The brilliance was in how ordinary it looked. Inspectors saw steel tubes welded into the frame. Smokey saw free space waiting to be filled. He disguised his innovation behind the guise of safety, and for a while, nobody caught on. When NASCAR finally did, the outrage was immediate. Safety equipment was sacred. Using it as a cheat felt to many like crossing an invisible line. But to Smokey, it was just another loophole. "If they didn't say I couldn't, then I can," he shrugged. NASCAR responded by tightening regulations, specifying tubing sizes and outlawing anything that could hold fuel. Smokey had lost the loophole, but won the legend. Stock car racing was all about airflow, and Smokey knew aerodynamics before most teams could even spell the word. He discovered that by subtly raising the roof by fractions of an inch, or lowering the floor pan ever so slightly, he could change the car's entire profile. The result? Less drag, better stability, and a car that cheated the wind while looking completely stock. The genius was in the subtlety. To inspectors, the cars passed every measurement. To drivers, they felt smoother, faster, and more planted at high speeds. Rivals often suspected something was off, but Smokey's tweaks were so small, mere millimeters at times, that proving them was nearly impossible. This approach showcased Smokey's obsession with the details no one else considered. While others fought for raw horsepower, he hunted for invisible gains in sheet metal and body geometry. NASCAR eventually cracked down with stricter templates and body inspections, but by then Smokey had proven a truth that still defines racing today. Aerodynamics win races just as much as engines. The Holley carburetor was standard equipment in NASCAR, and on the surface, every team ran the same part. But Smokey knew where to look for hidden horsepower. He mastered the art of microscopic carburetor modifications, polishing surfaces, tweaking jets, adjusting flow in ways so subtle inspectors could barely detect them. To the naked eye, the carburetor looked untouched. To the engine, it breathed better, delivering more power and smoother throttle response. Rivals swore Smokey had found magic under the hood. In reality, it was meticulous craftsmanship. Inspectors eventually learned to strip carburetors down to their smallest pieces, looking for Smokey's fingerprints. But by then, the damage was done. His modified carbs gave his drivers extra edge in crucial moments. And once again, NASCAR was left scrambling to close a loophole it hadn't realized existed. Smokey's carb tricks highlight his larger genius. He didn't always chase the big, flashy hacks. Sometimes he found speed in places so small most people never bothered to look. And in racing, those tiny edges often made all the difference. In NASCAR, every pound mattered. Smokey Yunick knew that a lighter car accelerated faster, handled better, and ran cooler tires over long distances. But NASCAR's rules locked down fuel tank size at 22 gallons. Nothing more, nothing less. Smokey couldn't change the capacity. What he could change was the weight. So he built thin-walled fuel tanks. To the naked eye, they looked identical to the standard equipment. Inspectors measured the dimensions and signed off without hesitation. But Smokey's tanks were made from lighter material, shaving precious pounds without sacrificing volume. On the track, those pounds translated to faster lap times, quicker pit exits, and an edge over everyone else. The brilliance of the move was in its invisibility. Rivals could scream foul, but unless NASCAR cut open the tank, they couldn't prove anything. And Smokey thrived on that razor's edge, legal by measurement, illegal by intent. Eventually, officials caught on. When they realized Smokey had manipulated something as standard as a fuel tank, NASCAR cracked down, enforcing weight minimums and materials restrictions. But by then, Smokey had already cashed in on the advantage and once again embarrassed the rule makers. Smokey's obsession with airflow bordered on an art form. He knew that an engine's performance wasn't just about what went in, but how smoothly air moved through the car. He began experimenting with vents, ducts, and hidden passages that disguised themselves as ordinary features, but secretly changed how air circulated. Some ducts fed cooler air to the engine, reducing overheating and squeezing out horsepower. Others subtly managed airflow around the car's body, reducing drag and turbulence. He even disguised vents as decorative features, things inspectors dismissed as cosmetic. But every single tweak was designed to shave fractions of a second per lap. Competitors couldn't figure it out. Smokey's cars seemed to run cooler, last longer, and cut cleaner through the air. On hot days, when engines boiled and slowed, his cars kept charging. Drivers felt the difference even if they couldn't see it. Inspectors, once again, were left chasing ghosts. This relentless focus on air manipulation was decades ahead of its time. Modern NASCAR cars are engineered with wind tunnels and CFD simulations. Smokey was doing it with gut instinct, tin snips, and a chalk line. Among Smokey Yunick's creations, one stood out as mythical, the so-called golden car. Rivals swore it was the slickest, most finely tuned piece of machinery ever to touch asphalt. It wasn't just fast, it looked too perfect. The bodywork hugged tighter, the panels lined up flawlessly. Even the way it sat on the track seemed unnatural, like it had been engineered in a wind tunnel years before NASCAR even thought of one. Nobody could prove exactly what Smokey did to it. Some suspected hidden panel shifts. Others whispered about secret ducting or altered wheelbase geometry. Smokey never told. All he'd admit was that the car lived in the grayest of the gray zones, exploiting every vague line of the rulebook. NASCAR hated it. Rivals despised it, but fans loved it. To them, the golden car wasn't cheating. It was artistry. It embodied everything Smokey represented, a willingness to outthink, outbuild, and outlast the system. In the end, NASCAR shut it down, but not before the golden car became legend, a symbol of the outlaw spirit that defined Smokey Yunick. Even decades later, teams whisper about it as if it were racing's holy grail, the car that proved innovation could be more dangerous than horsepower itself. In NASCAR, ballast, the extra weight used to balance a car, was supposed to be secured and standardized. But Smokey Yunick didn't see lead bricks. He saw opportunities. He experimented with hiding ballast in unconventional places, tucked inside frame rails disguised as structural parts, or mounted in ways that gave him more control over how the car handled. One of Smokey's most cunning ideas was movable ballast. Stories circulate that he developed weight that could be shifted, or even dropped, during a race. Imagine starting a run heavy for traction, then secretly dumping weight mid-race for better speed. Rivals couldn't prove it, but they swore Smokey's cars seemed to change character as races wore on, gripping harder in corners early, then flying down straights when it mattered most. NASCAR eventually outlawed anything resembling movable weight. Today, ballast must be bolted down with specific hardware. That's the Smokey effect. His innovations were so outrageous that entire sections of the rulebook exist because of him. To Smokey, it wasn't cheating, it was strategy. To NASCAR, it was chaos. Every driver knows tires win races. Smokey Yunick knew they could also lose them, so he pushed the limits like no one else. One of his boldest tricks involved running dangerously low tire pressures. Lower pressure meant more rubber on the track and better grip, especially in corners. It gave Smokey's cars a massive advantage when others were sliding loose. But the downside was just as dramatic. Tires could overheat, buckle, or even blow apart. Smokey accepted the risk, gambling that the extra speed would pay off before disaster struck. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but it always kept competitors on edge. Even more clever, Smokey reportedly found ways to hide his true pressures from inspectors. By using heated tires or sneaky inflation techniques, he could disguise the readings long enough to pass tech. Once the race began, his drivers were rolling on setups nobody else dared to try. NASCAR eventually regulated tire minimums, forcing teams into safer ranges. But Smokey's daring experiments proved one thing: in racing, grip is gold. And sometimes you have to risk everything to find it. For all the fuel tricks, hidden cages, and aerodynamic wizardry, Smokey Yunick's greatest weapon wasn't mechanical. It was psychological. He didn't just beat cars, he beat people. Smokey studied NASCAR inspectors as closely as he studied engines. He knew their habits, their blind spots, even their tempers. If officials zeroed in on one area, say the carburetor, Smokey would distract them with something else. He'd argue, crack jokes, or even stage decoy cheats just to throw them off the scent of the real one. Some stories claim he built cars with multiple cheats layered in, betting that once inspectors found the first trick, they'd stop looking. More often than not, he was right. Smokey also weaponized his reputation. Officials expected him to cheat, so he used that expectation against them, planting suspicion where none existed while his real innovations passed unnoticed. He turned inspection into a chess match, and more often than not, he was 3 moves ahead.
In the end, Smokey's ultimate trick wasn't the shrunk Chevelle or the 11-foot fuel line. It was proving that rules are only as strong as the people enforcing them. He didn't just build cars that bent the rule book. He built legends that bent the minds.